Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Hardcore Survival Guide. I know it's been a while, not to worry. We are going to get started on a little bit more building to start this episode. I want to do a bit more work on the tower. Now I have got a decent amount of moss from the moss farm that we made in the last episode. That's kind of the next stage of building this thing. I want to make sure we have plenty of mossy brick, mossy cobblestone, and the moss blocks themselves all over the top of this tower. I do want to do a little bit more with the tuff around that as well. I think tuff actually works really well next to the mossy color palette. It has that ever so slight touch of yellowish green to it, which I think works really well with mossy cobblestone and those other types of blocks. But I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing this before we settle into the main idea for this episode. So give me a second, I'll be back once I've done a bit more work on the tower. So construction on the tower has continued, but rather embarrassingly, I have run out of stone. I have plenty of cobblestone which I could smelt, but I'm thinking I need to gather a little bit more natural stone. And so for that, I put efficiency finally onto my Silk Touch pickaxe, and we're going to take that down here. We're going to go back to the abandoned mine shaft that we discovered in previous episodes, because today I want to talk a little bit about Amethyst Geodes and how best to harvest them. And for that, we need to return to this mine shaft because it has, I think, about 3 different geodes in it. There are a lot of geodes in this general area, and it would behoove us to clear out some of the area around those, including the blocks that aren't relevant to growing amethyst shards themselves, and from there we'll discuss what we want to do to actually harvest the amethyst shards from the amethyst buds where they grow. I've also brought a ton of torches so I can light up more of this place, and hopefully we will experience slightly fewer interruptions in the process. So back here in this direction, I think if I turn left, yes, here we go, we enter a single geode on this side, but there is also another geode off to the side here. That wall there is actually taken up by another geode, which I can't quite remember how we get around to. Perhaps it's down here, maybe through a wall somewhere around here. I can't quite see the way to it, but there are basically 2 geodes side by side, one large and one small, which means there's going to be quite a large concentration of amethyst growing blocks in this area. If I'm careful not to get shot by skeletons, I can probably actually just hop down here, take care of that guy. There we go. And as you can see, yes, we have one geode here, which I'll light up a little bit more. The crystals will let off a little bit of light, but not enough to block mob spawning entirely. We'll light up this whole area, and as you can see from this little walkway, we have one geode here and one geode here. And if you want to farm amethyst shards from a geode to make tinted glass or spyglasses, or in fact renewable amethyst blocks, what you'll need is to locate these blocks behind the large clusters. And I'm going to fortune this one actually. We're going to just break that like so, and you'll see a block that has this kind of cross shape on it. That is a budding amethyst block. Those are the ones that are capable of regrowing amethyst clusters. And I don't think you will actually find amethyst clusters growing anywhere else. You'll only ever find them growing from those blocks, even as the geode has generated. So typically, if you look for where the clusters are growing when you arrive at a geode, that is where you will find amethyst clusters being able to regrow. And to maximize the potential of these amethyst clusters to drop amethyst shards, you'll want to use a Fortune 3 pickaxe. Fortune 3 will allow you to get a lot of amethyst shards per crystal. You can only harvest the fully grown crystals, which you can see on the F3 screen are called amethyst clusters, instead of, if you look at one of the smaller ones, they are amethyst buds in small, medium, and large sizes. And they will usually drop in even numbers, which is quite convenient because you need 4 amethyst shards to create a full block of amethyst. Obviously, you'll use shards in odd numbers to create things like spyglasses. I think tinted glass also uses 4 amethyst shards at a time, so generally speaking, you want to get a decent amount of these things if you want to do anything with their products. And by harvesting all the fully grown amethyst clusters in this geode, we should hopefully come away with enough amethyst shards to make a decent amount of blocks. Throughout this process, I'm making very sure that I don't end up accidentally breaking any of the budding amethyst blocks, because those cannot be regrown, they cannot be converted from other amethyst blocks, you cannot craft them, and they also cannot be moved. So basically, as soon as you have found a budding amethyst block, that is the position that it will stay in permanently. You can't push them with pistons. The only thing you could potentially do would be to go into creative mode and relocate them using commands, or grab one out of the creative inventory and place it wherever you want it. But if you find one of these in survival and you're not planning on using cheats to move them around, you basically have to farm a geode in the location that you find it. The cool thing about these though is that amethyst can grow on all 6 faces of a budding amethyst block, provided that it isn't obstructed by anything else. And so what we're going to do is actually clear out the rest of the blocks from around this geode, leaving only the budding amethyst left. And that's why I have brought 4 shulker boxes with me. We're going to have to light up the area around here to make sure we don't get too much interference from mobs while we're doing it. But basically all of the rest of these blocks can be broken and brought with us, and we're going to bring a whole bunch of this back to the house, but we're going to leave the budding amethyst blocks here and come back and harvest them whenever we want some amethyst shards for tinted glass or anything else. A couple of other things worth noting is that any of the clusters of amethyst, whether they are buds or if they are full clusters, can be silk touched, and they remain at the size they were when you harvested them. So these full amethyst clusters can be harvested with silk touch. They can also be placed on basically any full block, and they may even be attached to some other surfaces as well. So you can just silk touch that and take it with you. That can be broken down into amethyst shards later. Of course, it doesn't have to be attached to the budding amethyst block to drop crystals. We can basically place this on a block of stone and then fortune it later. We'll still get some amethyst shards if you want to conserve some space. The large, medium, and small amethyst buds are just going to be decorative blocks. They can prevent mob spawns if you want to use them for that, and you can place them back onto a budding amethyst block at any time if you want them to continue growing. But they will not grow on regular amethyst blocks, so once again, the budding amethyst blocks are necessary for the crystal growing process. And breaking any of the amethyst buds that grow from these blocks doesn't get us anything if we use fortunes. So once again, we have to wait for them to be fully grown amethyst clusters before we make that particular move. So I'm going to continue to take down some of the buds from this cave because I actually want to do a little bit of building with them at some point later. But after that, we're going to take out every single block around here that is not a budding amethyst, probably take out a bunch of stone as well because I need that for building, and we're going to see what this looks like when it is just the budding amethyst blocks. Hey folks, welcome back. So the tower is finally getting built. I actually have a little bit more resources now, thanks to all the work we've been doing down here in this mineshaft, clearing out the area around the geodes. And I say geodes not just because there are 2 of them, there is a 3rd one that I managed to dig out as well. And I've also done a little bit of work to open out the path to them. So those 2 geodes were actually really close to our entrance to the mineshaft here, and now we've cleared those out. You can see we're actually getting a whole lot more amethyst crystals than you were initially able to see in the geode, thanks to the fact that we've opened out the blocks on all 6 sides, and of course all 6 faces are able to bud with a crystal as long as they don't overlap with another crystal. So what we have here is a pretty decent amount of amethyst. This section here immediately in front of us was 1 geode, and this section over here was the 2nd smaller geode that kind of added onto the side of the first. Not only that, but once we get down here, if I just sneak down into the 2nd level of the mineshaft and check my shoulders for creepers because you can never be too careful in these places, at the end here we have another geode that I was able to dig out, which probably has about as many budding amethyst blocks as the first, meaning we have kind of 2.5 geodes here, really. The little one is only going to provide us with maybe 10 budding amethyst blocks, whereas this one looks like closer to 30, and I assume that is the same with the one in the main chamber there as well. So now we come to the question of how to harvest all of these, because your natural inclination might be to try and automate some of this, and try and get those crystals growing to a point where they've grown to their fullest stage. An observer might detect that maybe, and then a piston could push the crystals off and they'd get collected in a hopper. Unfortunately, it is not that simple, and we're going to go into a couple of reasons why. The first being that if you harvest one of these fully grown amethyst crystals, like this one is, an amethyst cluster right there, with anything other than a pickaxe, you do not get as many amethyst shards. In fact, when it drops like that, you're pretty much always going to get 2. An unenchanted pickaxe will potentially get you more. I think it gets you 4 shards if you harvest it with an actual pickaxe. Let me chuck these out of my inventory for a second. A fortune pickaxe will actually get you between 8 and 16 in increments of 4 each time. So you can get 8, you can get 12, or you can get 16. I think those are the numbers in which these clusters drop their shards with Fortune 3, at least. With Fortune 1, obviously, you have a chance to get a couple more. But the most you're going to get from any of these clusters, if you break it with anything other than a pickaxe, is still going to be 2 shards. And so mathematically speaking, if we look at all of these, even if we harvested the crystals from each of these buds when the buds were fully grown into amethyst clusters, if we did that with pistons and got 2 shards each time, and then we fortuned all of the clusters in this smaller geode here, I'm fairly certain we would get more from the smaller geode than we would from the bigger one. I think if you want a bunch of amethyst shards in a shortish amount of time, the most sensible thing to do is come down here with a fortune pickaxe and break them manually. So here, for example, is a pretty simple redstone counting circuit that I've come up with in a creative test world. It's probably not the most compact counter that there is out there, but it is one of the more compact designs that would be possible, I guess, with redstone. What we're going to need is a couple of droppers, a comparator, a repeater, and a redstone torch. We'll also need a couple of observers. We'll need 3 total, I think, and 1 sticky piston. So let's say, for example, we want to measure the output of one of these faces here, just 1 crystal growing at a time. Of course, we're going to need an observer to detect when that crystal grows. We're going to need some kind of block behind that so it isn't powering both droppers at once, because the droppers are going to be shuffling items back and forth between them. This first dropper is going to be counting each time the crystal grows, and the second dropper is just there to feed the items back into the first one once it's done counting. So it'll put 4 amethyst shards in here just as our items, and then obviously anytime a block in front of this observer changes, so I'll place a torch there, it's going to power this piece of cobblestone, which is going to remove 1 amethyst shard from the dropper. It's going to spit it directly into the dropper next to it. This circuit is also silent, which is kind of a nice feature of it. Then if that happens 3 more times, all of the amethyst shards are now in this dropper. So these droppers have just counted that 4 things have happened in front of this observer, and that's basically what we want here, because the amethyst crystals have 4 stages of growth: the small bud, the medium-sized bud, the large bud, and then finally the large cluster. We might actually end up needing a 5th stage in the end, because if a piston is going to break this, then that also counts as something happening in front of the observer, so chances are we would need to add a 5th item. But for the sake of this argument, we're going to just add 4. So let's presume that this dropper has now counted 4 items. We need those to go back into the first dropper in order for it to be able to count again. And in order to do that, we're going to set up a small circuit next door, which is going to require a comparator and a repeater facing out in this way. It will just set to 1 tick for now. That's going to deactivate a redstone torch if there are any items in this dropper here. I'll put another amethyst shard in here, for example. The comparator detects that this dropper has contents. That turns on this redstone circuit, turning off the redstone torch. Next to the redstone torch, powered by quasi-connectivity, we're going to have a sticky piston here, and that's going to push an observer up into place, creating a very short observer clock, which is going to push all the items from this dropper back into the first one. So with 4 items in this first dropper and nothing in the back dropper, I'm going to show you briefly how that works. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go, and all 4 items are back in the dropper. It happens quite quickly, so it's kind of difficult to show this in action, but let's say 2 things happen in front of this. The amethyst crystal grows 2 stages. That means there are 2 items in this dropper at the back here, and 2 items in this dropper at the front. The circuit is still on, so this redstone torch is still disabled, and the piston down there has not been powered. It happens 1 more time. We get 3 items in there, 1 item in there. As soon as those items leave, there we go. All of the items get pushed out of the dropper by this circuit, and it only ticks 4 times in quick succession, thanks to the fact that pushing and pulling the observer around also triggers this observer a couple of times. That's one of the only ways I've been able to conceive of putting all 4 items from this dropper back into this dropper and beginning the counting process again. My point here is that even just to count 4 things happening in front of an observer, it takes an awful lot of redstone. And remember, we wanted to apply this to potentially every single face of every single amethyst crystal in here. That is going to be a lot of redstone just to get 2 shards every time a piston fires. It's really not worth it. And remember once again that this isn't just going to be a case of detecting when a crystal grows using an observer, because the amethyst buds, even the large amethyst buds, don't actually give you any amethyst shards when they are broken. So if a small amethyst bud starts to form, an observer immediately detects that and fires a piston, I mean, for a start, it's going to create a redstone clock, which is not what you want. But secondly, we don't get any amethyst shards from that. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as just plonking an observer down in front of this and letting it do all the work. Observers, fundamentally, cannot count to more than one. So I'd argue the best solution to this would be to set up pistons facing towards every single crystal in here and rig them all up to a very, very slow timer. What that would do is allow all of the crystals to grow to a certain age, and by very slow, I'm talking probably about an hour. By that time, you could imagine that all of the crystals in here might have grown to their fourth and final stage, which could potentially mean that when they are harvested, you would harvest every single crystal all at once. You're not detecting when they're grown to their final stage and harvesting them at the most efficient time for that crystal, but ultimately it's going to end up with a bunch of crystals being harvested all at once, and you leave enough time to guarantee they've grown to that stage without having to do so much redstone. Of course, that does mean you need to run redstone wire to a piston facing into every single face of these amethyst blocks, which seems like quite a tough thing to do, especially if you want the top and bottom faces as well. You could have 4 pistons facing down around each of the vertical faces, but the horizontal faces require pistons either pushing down from the top of them, which is going to be more difficult to collect the amethyst shards, or across them, which is going to complicate the redstone for the pistons below. You're also going to have the problem that some of these crystals grow next to each other, which gives you less room to maneuver some of the redstone, and ultimately it's going to be a bit of a pain without breaking the budding blocks and losing the potential for those crystals to grow in the first place. One final thing to consider is that amethyst crystals only grow based on random game ticks, which is the same mechanic that allows crops to grow. And for random ticks to occur, a player actually has to be in the vicinity. You might notice this if you've ever built a farm, like a crop farm, a wheat farm, whatever kind of farm, at spawn, and then gone away from there and built your base somewhere else. If you come back to spawn, even though those chunks have been permanently loaded, the crops will not have grown, because a player needs to be nearby in order for the game to random tick those blocks. So unfortunately, if we aren't close enough to this geode that the game is going to random tick some of the blocks and allow the crystals to grow, we're not going to get any output from it at all, which means the player basically needs to be around here. You need to virtually AFK at one of these areas, or at least be doing a bunch of base building in the vicinity in order for the crystals to grow in the first place. So you're going to be here anyway. Frankly, you may as well do this process manually. In which case, the best approach is going to be scaffolding, making sure that you've got enough height that you can reach up to each of the crystals in this geode, make sure that you get the ones growing on the tops as well, and just harvesting everything manually with your best fortune pickaxe. The other thing you might want to consider in this process is having some sort of collection mechanism, which you would need to have if you automated the system anyway, but I've seen a couple of different approaches to this, which are honestly pretty cool. I've seen people take the approach of flooding the entire geode chamber, since the amethyst crystals can also be waterlogged. That allows you to have all of the crystals float up to the surface, where you can either collect them manually, or another water stream can basically propel all of the drops into a collection hopper. Stick a conduit in there with you so you have permanent water breathing, and it makes for a pretty effective way of harvesting everything. Also means you don't have to worry about scaffolding, because you can float around to reach all of the crystals. If you're doing things the way I am and manually mining all of these crystals out, then you might want to consider putting some sort of hopper collection mechanism into the floor, whether it's hopper minecarts running on a track or just a massive pad of hoppers underneath here, because a lot of the crystals are going to just fall straight to the floor, and if you don't want to have all of the space carved out in your inventory to make sure that you collect all the crystals at once, then you can just have them all picked up by hopper minecarts and transferred to a central storage chest. Naturally, that's not really going to help if a bunch of the crystals end up dropping onto other nearby budding amethyst blocks, but it's going to get you a decent amount of crystals regardless. And speaking of a decent amount of crystals, we had less than a stack before I started this, and now having mined out most of the crystals that were fully grown on these clusters over here, we've ended up with almost 6 stacks, which is a pretty decent total for a smallish geode. Remember that with Fortune 3, we have the potential to get 8 times the amount of shards from each of these crystals. If you're harvesting these with a piston or some other kind of tool that wasn't a pickaxe, you would only be getting 2 each time, meaning that we would have less than a stack from harvesting all of those crystals by any other means. So the best thing to do is going to be to find an optimal spot to start a bunch of scaffolding, and then just placing platforms out towards the harder to reach crystals in the geode. Once you've got a decent amount of scaffolding, you should be able to do this no problem. And if maneuverability on scaffolding is a bit of a pain to you, then you can always make these out of more permanent blocks, add ladders, you know, that kind of stuff. Make sure that it is just the most convenient way for you to do it. I would say the only drawbacks to this method are that you have to go and mine everything manually, of course, which is kind of a pain, although I think it's worth it in exchange for a higher output of Amethyst shards. It's also a task that you have to kind of maintain concentration for, because there's always a chance that you might misclick and end up destroying one of the budding Amethyst blocks, which you don't want. But as you can see, my inventory is already filling up with these Amethyst shards, meaning that we're going to have a whole lot of these by the time I'm done harvesting the entire thing, and that's not even counting the geode in the next room. It does feel like a slow process at the time, especially when it feels like you turn around and a crystal has finished growing again by the time you're done with all of this. But frankly, in terms of time spent per amethyst shard out, I think this is going to be the best method of doing it. So with all of the crystals in here manually harvested, and I say all of them, but I think some of them have actually been growing a little bit more since I've started harvesting all of these shards, we have a second shulker box on the go that is already more than halfway full. So in total, we have, I would say, about close to 50 stacks of amethyst shards at this point from just 2 geodes with Fortune 3. I think that's honestly worth harvesting this stuff manually every so often. If you need a huge amount of tinted glass and you've got a geode underneath your base that you can automate, that might just about be worth it. But frankly, I think it's always going to be worth it to take half an hour to come down here, strip all of the geodes here of their crystals, and come away with a bunch more amethyst shards in the process. And having that geode in such close proximity to the first 2 geodes means that a bunch of the crystals here have grown back as well. So if I just want to go back and forth for a couple of hours, I expect we would still get a pretty decent yield of crystals at the end of that. But that is probably where we're going to wrap up today's episode. I have been doing a bit more work on the tower, but it's not quite finished yet, and so we're going to take a little bit more time between episodes and work on that. But that is where we're going to leave it for today. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Hardcore Survival Guide. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye for now.